Welcome to The Human Variable, where we learn about the complicated intertwining of science and public policy. I'm Manaeha Rao, and this week's episode is called Tackling Environmental Racism, where we'll be learning about the environmental justice movement in Chicago.
These citizens who are taxpayers are having their own taxes used to poison them.
Today, I'm going to dive into environmental racism and the environmental justice movement in Chicago. I got into this topic after reading Clean and White, A History of Environmental Racism in the U.S. by Dr. Carl Zimring. I was fortunate enough to get to interview the environmental historian himself, and in the second half of the episode, you'll hear my interview with Joshi Radin, an environmental educator and activist who works for the Pilsen Environmental Rights and Reform Organization here in Chicago. Let's get started with Dr. Carl Zimring. Could I just get your pronouns and maybe just like a quick introduction from your end?
Sure. My name is Carl Zimring. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a professor in the Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies at Pratt Institute, where I coordinate the Sustainability Studies undergraduate program. I'm an environmental historian, particularly interested in thinking about how concepts of waste shape practices, politics, social divisions, and attitudes over time.
With that, I asked Carl the most important question. What is environmental racism?
Okay, environmental racism as a concept was articulated about 40 years ago. And the notion, as Dr. Benjamin Chavez said, and I talk about in the introduction of Clean and White, is practices and patterns that involve policies that expose people of color to environmental dangers, often involving toxics and waste. It also involves the shutting out of people of color from environmental decision-making, whether that be in the halls of power in Congress, in City Hall, or in environmental groups such as the Audubon Society or the Sierra Club. Environmental racism is a form of structural or systemic racism. It's not simply an individual saying, I do not like you on the basis of your heritage, but it is a structural discrimination that places entire categories of people at risk involving environmental hazards.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. So just to reiterate that, there's definitely a systemic sort of core issue to this. It isn't just a social phenomenon.
Absolutely. It's systemic. It involves policy. It involves economics. It involves land use. And while environmental racism has been articulated as such since the early 1980s, one of my arguments in the book is that the actual structural racism of environmental racism has a much longer history going back throughout the history of the Republic.
Oh, wow. Okay, so could you touch on that a little bit of maybe some of the earliest examples we see of environmental racism?
Oh, sure. Well, one of the early structures is who does what jobs in this country? Because if environmental racism involves exposure to toxins or waste, the people who handle garbage, medical waste, recycling, the folks who are janitors in our buildings who do our laundry work are going to get exposed to a lot more waste. And obviously, the people doing what I called in a much earlier article, dirty work on plantations, were slaves. So if you were cleaning the laundry in a Louisiana plantation in the 1830s, chances are you weren't someone who would be identified as white. And one of the points that I start making is this conflation of race with pollution itself becomes crucial. And actually, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, bouncing between the present day and the 1820s, because a key thing that happens is slavery gets abolished with the Civil War and the abolition of slavery as part of the end of the war. So suddenly this economic and political system is gone, but the justifications for it don't leave. And so scientific racism actually proliferates after 1865. And the vote gets suppressed, but also residential segregation starts becoming more common. And I'm a native of Chicago, and I'm a native of the south side of Chicago. And Chicago is famous for, after about 1910, a couple of waves of great migration of African Americans coming up from the south come to the city, where they are hyper-segregated into ghettos on the city's south and west sides. And interestingly enough, the University of Chicago is kind of a very policed island within one of those ghettos, with Woodlawn, Kenwood, Washington Park, and South Shore, my old neighborhood there, being ones that become 90% African American by the middle of the 20th century.
Carl then went on to describe the process of redlining, in which Black and brown communities were kept from becoming residents of certain areas through a systematic denial of mortgages, insurance, loans, etc., based on race.
If you look at the census by the 1960s, there are some patterns of ethnic settlements, which makes a lot of sense. People will often live near their cousins, their friends, their community members. But you don't see, except with African Americans, incidents where 95% of all the people in your census tract being the same race as you. African Americans are the exception, and it's because of the structural racism of the U.S. housing market. And places like the South Side of Chicago, this leads to neighborhood turnover. Like Woodlawn used to have a lot of middle-class white residents, and this notion of white flight where they're selling and then moving to the suburbs takes place. What a lot of it is a lot of the rationalization is they're bringing down property values, and the tragedy is that's correct. Having Black neighbors did bring down property values because the system was racist. And that's one of the major reorganizations that takes place. Another one is, where do dumps go? Where do recycling centers and scrapyards go? One of the reasons I wrote this book is my first book is a history of scrap recycling in the United States. And I started looking at data where I realized that between 1920 and 1960 in the city of Chicago, most of the places where scrap metal were recycled were on the city's south and west sides. And this is 20 years before the term environmental racism is discussed. That's the end point of the studies I was looking at. It's 60 years before when the first maps I see of these patterns take place. So where people live and where waste gets cited become conflated by race. And in the 1980s, because of a number of protests, a study takes place called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, uses two federal databases. One is the Census of Population by Address for 1980, and the other is the U.S. EPA's Inventory of Toxic Waste Sites. And what this study published in 1987 finds is that race by far is the most salient variable in determining whether or not you live near a toxic waste site. It's not north versus south, east versus west. It's not rural versus urban. It's not by class either. You could be an upper middle class African American, and you're more likely to live near a toxic waste site than if you're a working class white farmer in, say, Iowa. And in fact, one of the famous environmental justice protests happens in Houston, where there's a garbage dump put in a Black neighborhood. And two of the residents that organize are a lawyer and her husband, who's a grad student in sociology at that point. This is Linda and Robert Bullard. And Robert Bullard, when he realizes, oh, I've got a pretty good topic in sociology, and he becomes really the academic father of the environmental justice movement in the 1980s, writing about this structural racism problem. So it's noticed and identified 40 years ago by people like Linda and Robert Bullard, but the actual conditions for it are much, much older.
So maybe we could move on to talking a little bit more about the specific justice movement that sort of has emerged due to the environmental racism, obviously. Can you talk a little bit about its first emergence in the 1980s and where we are today?
Oh, happy to. And I've actually started to anticipate that so the Houston movement is at the very end of the 1970s. The very famous movement, and there are a number of books on this, happens in North Carolina. Back 70 years ago, we started putting a lot of chemicals in industrial society because we thought it made life safer. And so an idea was, let's make the building more flame retardant. So we started putting asbestos in buildings. It was considered a safety feature, and it was for the first 30 or 40 years. But then when it starts to disintegrate and people started breathing it, incurable fatal cancers of the respiratory system take place. Other chemicals that are human-made, because asbestos is actually a mineral that's mined, start proliferating for the same reason. We start creating things called PCBs, and we dip transformers in it so that the power grid, as we're building in the 1930s and 40s, doesn't have huge explosions and fires. Turns out those chemicals, too, are very durable and have a number of human health consequences. So as the environmental movement is growing in the 1960s and 70s, books like Silent Spring are published. We start worrying about our food, our water, our environment, and we start looking at a lot of these chemicals. And by the early 1970s, the federal government starts banning things like PCBs. And so a long period begins of trying to remove these from electrical stations in big cities like Charlotte, North Carolina. It makes a lot of sense. The problem is, when you remove toxic chemicals, where do you put them? One of the reasons I love talking about waste is my advisor at Carnegie Mellon is a man named Joel Tarr, and he came up with this concept called the search for the ultimate sink. A sink is a place where we put the things we don't want. So the Chicago metro area has a few million people. Everyone's got biological needs. We all have to defecate. So it goes into the water system. And so there's a massive wastewater treatment facility in the western suburbs that keeps people from getting cholera. The notion of searching for the ultimate sink is finding a way of tossing away our unwanted stuff without any consequence. That's always been our goal in industrial society. And we can never do it. There are always consequences. So when we start defining material as toxic waste, that's going to have human health hazards, and we have to throw it away. Where is there in a way that won't hurt people? And in North Carolina, what the government did was try to think what would be the greatest possible good. So if you've got a few 100,000 people in Charlotte and a few 100,000 people in the Raleigh area, you don't want to put the toxic waste near them. You don't want to burn this because it might cause fumes, and it could also lead to water pollution as well. So burying it in the ground makes a lot of sense. Where do you do it? Maybe a rural place where there aren't as many people is a way to go. And what the government ultimately does in 1982, the government of the state of North Carolina is sited in a town called Afton, North Carolina, which mostly has dirt roads. It's only got a few thousand people. And basically everyone who lives there is black and very poor. And in a democracy, this unfortunately makes a horrific amount of sense. Because if you're the governor of North Carolina and you're worried about making people mad, do you make a few 100,000 constituents mad in an urban or suburban area? Or do you make 3,000 or 4,000 people mad who don't have the money to attack you with ads or put up a candidate for themselves? The people of Afton, North Carolina had very little recourse when a PCB dump was slated to be put in their community in 1982. And I'll actually frame this a slightly different way. These citizens who are taxpayers are having their own taxes used to poison them. And I'm just saying this for North Carolina. This is happening in Chicago right now with General Iron, which has been moved from the Lincoln Park area down to the south side. And it happens all over the country. Anyway, there's not a whole lot of political recourse that legally the residents can do, But what happens is the bulldozers come in, and I'm going to simplify this a little bit. They start passive resistance, lying down in the road so the bulldozers can't come in. And they contact not the Sierra Club, not the Audubon Society, but the structures of the civil rights movement from the 1950s and 60s, mostly in African churches, African American churches, because they see this as a civil rights problem. We are getting polluted upon because we are black, is essentially what's happening here. This is racism using toxins. And so very quickly in 1982, a coalition of civil rights groups comes to Warren County, to Afton, North Carolina, and participates in this. It gets national news, gets national attention, and a lot of the language of the civil rights movement gets adapted to talk about this environmental problem. And this movement does not prevent the dump from being cited. 1983, the bulldozers win. They put the dump in. But this coalition of environmental and civil rights groups doesn't stop working. And so from the Afton ultimately failure to stop the dump, you get a consciousness of environmental racism. And within a decade, there is the Rio Declaration about environmental racism, which is looking at not just in the United States, but throughout the world, that there are these racial dimensions to environmental hazard, and that people deserve to have not only clean environments, but, and this is crucial, a right to self-determination. Let us, as the community members, determine what is safe and reasonable for us. Do not impose your ideas upon us. And from there have been some other changes as well. And one of the things that Bob Bullard talks about is that the established environmental advocacy groups, such as the Sierra Club, that had real problems around race 30, 40 years ago, have made some strides on that. The federal government, starting in the 1990s, also started to look at environmental justice as a concern when thinking about environmental problems under the Clinton administration. And while there have been some hiccups on that, mostly in the last 4 years, but not exclusively, there has been a sense that government structures are more cooperative and just cognizant of these issues than they had been in the 1980s, when supposedly progressive Democratic governor of North Carolina poisons his black constituents out of the greater good. So one of the nice things about the last 35 years or so is this groundswell and the coalitions of environmental justice groups. Chicago is actually a quite famous city for this. And if you read Barack Obama's first memoir, he talks about being a community organizer in Chicago after graduating from Columbia University. And he very early on gets involved on the far south side of Chicago in residential movements to keep their housing project from being poisoned by both industrial sites as well as the decaying infrastructure in Chicago Housing Authority buildings. And one of the famous people he meets in that is a woman named Hazel Johnson, who's one of the crucial people in Chicago for many years at this effort at leading to self-determination and not being poisoned by the powers that be, both in industry and in government. So Chicago is actually a great city to study both environmental racism and the resistance to environmental racism. With some real victories in Pilsen and Little Village, there were coal-burning electricity power plants that were horribly polluting the air, leading to high asthma rates, especially among children. In the last 10 years, those sites have been shuttered. So while there's a lot to do and there's still a lot of injustice in the city of Chicago around the environment, there have also been victories.
That's really good to hear.
So could you touch on how you've explained how the government is starting to sort of acknowledge this as a genuine and real systemic problem, but what about the American public? What is the sort of social, do people know about environmental racism when you explain your work? Does everybody, like, are they on board? Is it need to be more known? Do people think it's a threat?
So trying to unveil structural racism and make it more visible is really, really crucial in discussing environmental racism. Other things have also made this very visible. The Flint water crisis in Michigan is one of two that are particularly visible. Long story short, the state government takes over the city of Flint so that the residents no longer have a say in their government. And to save money, they switch the water supply. And the new water supply ends up poisoning the community, which is largely African American. The resistance movement that's come from that very quickly gets a national platform to discuss this. And just this week, it was announced that the then governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder, who's no longer the governor, is expecting to face charges based on his handling of the Flint water crisis. The other one involves U.S. energy, and U.S. energy policy has a lot of problems, one of which it's killing the planet. But the other is this construction of large pipelines throughout North America. And the one that went through the Dakota Rock tribes' lands in the Dakotas led to a resistance movement that has been brutally put down by the federal government. But again, the organizing of the movement has attracted national attention. So between Flint and the pipeline, there's been some very high-profile stories that environmental racism is a very real thing organizing the country. It's too early for me as a historian to speculate further, but I would argue that the way the COVID-19 pandemic has been experienced in this country reveals environmental racism. In part because there's now an obsession with cleaning infected areas of hospitals, of schools, of transit systems, and doing laundry as well. Who is doing the work to disinfect? Who is being exposed? It's people of color. And one of the things I stress in my book is this isn't static. Who is defined as white and who is defined as non-white changes over time, and the labor participation in these particular jobs will change over time. For example, you'll have many more people who are Hispanic doing this type of work after 1970 than you would in 1920 in a city like Chicago. So there may be shifts in who's doing it, but a constant is these people are ones who would not be identified by the dominant society as white. And we're seeing this in 2021, just as we saw it in 1982, just as we saw it in 1920, and I'd argue we saw it in 1820 as well.
Then could you touch on a little bit how, me personally, I feel like the image I think of when I think of the environmental movement as a whole is quite white, and it seems like a very white space. So how have you seen that space, that movement address environmental racism? Because there's clearly a racial component.
In the United States, we talk about the baby boom.
Carl goes on to describe how this boom really occurred, not just because soldiers were happy to see their wives after coming back from the front, but because this generation was actually given the economic structures to get themselves middle-class lives as early as in their 20s. They were able to successfully start their families and have stability and security. However, Carl brings up an incredibly salient point about this baby boom.
The modern middle class gets created out of this. But it's for white people. If you're black, you can't get a mortgage. You might get some of the benefits of this here and now, but systemically you're excluded from it. Who's going to these brand new suburbs? It's the white flight from the cities. And that's a big part of my book, that this creation of the suburban United States really has a racial component to it. And then what happens when they get to, say, suburban Long Island? Well, as the historian Adam Rome talks about in his wonderful book, The Bulldozer in the Countryside, they go to these clean, green, hilly places and they put in subdivisions. They put in septic tanks. Suddenly, the septic tanks start overflowing and you've got sewage in the front yard. You've got garbage piling up in the town dump. You're driving in your brand new General Motors car that you bought with your middle class salary to your job in the big city. So you're using gasoline that's got lead additives and you're putting all sorts of particulate matter into the atmosphere. Air pollution goes up. So all these new white middle class suburbanites are in their pastoral paradise and it's getting polluted. These are the people who create environmental groups or join older existing environmental groups and make them much larger. The population of these groups is white, middle class, and suburban. So that by the time Bob Bullard and Linda Bullard are talking about the problems of a dump being put in their Houston neighborhood, that's not something the Sierra Club thinks about as an issue, or the Audubon Society. They're worried about pure vistas that are natural and wild, making sure birds are healthy. And this leads to a great disjunct between the people who are getting the most environmental burdens in the country on them and groups that ostensibly would be ones that would be fighting for them. Related to that comes some very distasteful issues where environmental groups on the West Coast start advocating for limited or lower immigration in the late 80s and early 1990s, under the idea that if you have more immigrants, you have more humans who are despoiling the environment. So some xenophobia, whether unintentional or intentional, and I have opinions on the subject, but I'm willing to let people give the benefit of the doubt to organizations like the Sierra Club, led to some real concerns that the organizations were acting like white supremacists. And so in the late 80s and early 90s, it's not an accident that some of the early definitions of environmental racism include talking about these groups. Bob Bullard, in particular, I'm talking a lot about him, has done a lot of work with these existing environmental groups. There's some other history too. I mean, one of the issues is the Sierra Club, Audubon Society, Greenpeace, become much larger in the 1980s because there's a realization the federal government might not really care about the environment as much as we thought it would, because the Reagan Revolution very much tries to roll back environmental protections that didn't just take place under Carter and Lyndon Johnson, but under the Republicans Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford as well. So what it does is it makes these advocacy groups much, much larger and thus much more visible and much more powerful. And so when they have blind spots on race, those get magnified. During the 1990s, a lot of work was done, a lot of pressure was put upon these groups. And you see the boards of directors have diversified both in terms of gender and in terms of race. There have been discussions over how do we instill environmental justice principles in our overall mission. And I don't think in the year 2021 you would see a Sierra Club coming out for a zero immigration goal at this point. So there has definitely been progress on that front. One of the other interesting things is, of course, the environmental movement has changed. There are lots of local environmental justice organizations and alliances, and there are more recent groups such as Sunrise that have come about, organized by people about your age in frustration at the fact that we know we are putting too much carbon dioxide in the environment. We know we are seeing global as well as local devastation taking place environmentally, and we seem to be accelerating the conditions to make it worse. And so a lot of the more recent movements that have come up have been also resisting the older environmental movements and pressuring them to have alliances to speak more forcefully about drawdown, reducing greenhouse gases, and addressing issues such as Flint. So the environmental movement is fluid, it's dynamic, it keeps growing. It's much more diverse than someone would have guessed in 1972, looking at hippies recycling beer cans on the south side of Chicago. And there's more communication going on amongst the old established, historically whiter groups, the environmental justice groups that are 40 years old, and the groups that have been springing up over the last 4, 5, 6 years. So in many ways, this is a very dynamic, vigorous time to be involved in an environmental activism. But part of it is we recognize what the stakes are in ways that we didn't to the same extent, including the racial and social dynamics half a century ago.
So my final question for you then is, how do we break down some of these, the systemicness of environmental racism, if we can at all? Like, what are some tangible steps?
The first step, and I'm biased, I'm a historian, is to reveal systemic racism in its forms. Because if you're a lobster in a pot that's slowly coming to a boil, you may notice that you're uncomfortable, but you may not notice the conditions why. We are all lobsters in a very big pot, and some pots are more brutal than others. And follow-up studies from this now over 30-year study, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, indicates there has been some progress, but that race still is the most salient variable in determining whether or not you live near a toxic waste site, despite all the activism that's gone on. Environmental racism is not limited to the United States. I'm a specialist in it. But seeing how this takes place in countries like Canada, Brazil, France, South Africa, India, Russia, what the different constructions of this are in each of these societies, and how to meaningfully address this for more equitable societies is crucial. And I really hope that when you're my age and looking back at the 2020s, you can look at it with the distance of history and going, we've made so much wonderful progress since then. Because the future is not assured for that. It might go the other way. But we have the opportunity to make things better. And we have a large coalition of people who want to make it better. And telling the history of these injustices helps shine a light on what's actually going on now, with an understanding of it doesn't have to be this way.
Wow. I am in shock that more people don't know about this. Like, this isn't being taught, that all these connections, I feel like in my education, at least, we just set up so many boundaries and so many categories of civil rights is separate from environment, is separate from this, is separate from economic structures, but it's all much more intertwined than I think we, let ourselves believe.
On to my talk with Joshi Radin from Pilsen Environmental Rights and Reform Organization in order to see what grassroots environmental justice work looks like here in Chicago. Some other key organizations that combat environmental racism in the city include People for Community Recovery, Blacks in Green, Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, and countless more. Joshi can speak about herself.
I'll begin. My name is Joshi Radin, and I'm in Little Village, and I do work with the Pilsen Environmental Rights and Reform Organization. And I came to Chicago in 2014 to do graduate work, and I currently serve as a grassroots educator in the Illinois Solar for All programs, which is the low-income and environmental justice solar programs run by the state of Illinois. And I'm also creating cultural programming for the Goethe Institute Chicago on subjects of environmental justice in Chicago.
First off, why did you personally start your environmental justice work?
I moved to the Pilsen neighborhood, and so I had been attending and presenting at conferences. But what really felt missing to me was the grassroots work and the on-the-ground work. So when I moved to Pilsen, I just searched for environmental justice, Pilsen, and I found Berro, and I started attending meetings. And then Dorian Brewer, one of the co-founders, brought a grant opportunity for a grassroots educator position to the group, and I decided to go ahead and write that grant with some other organizers and volunteers, and it ended up coming through, and I decided, then that became one of my jobs. I should add also that Berro is a fully volunteer-run organization. So unlike some of other environmental activist groups around, there's no office, there's no paid staff, there's nobody on salary. So it's very scrappy, but also very dedicated, and it's a group of folks who are taking time out from their regular lives and jobs and families to work on these issues.
So could you talk a little bit about the history of environmental racism in Pilsen, or like what sorts of events have happened in Pilsen?
Sure. Look, these clouds that looked like possibly they were steam coming out of H. Kramer, which is a brass smelter in Pilsen in the early 2000s. And some residents decided to hold some meetings about, what was going on with this company, and it was non-responsive, and people were concerned, like what are in these clouds, and a meeting was held where Kramer had committed or said they would show up, and then they didn't show up. Eventually, Berro, it was trying to do some testing of soil and air, but some of the costs, it's cost prohibitive to do extensive testing. So they were fortunate and got some assistance, I believe, from a lab. And they were also reaching out to the EPA and the US EPA and Illinois EPA to get some support on testing what was actually being emitted from the smelter. And eventually it became evident that not only were there high amounts of lead being emitted through the stacks or the vents, but all of the soils in the neighboring residential yards were highly contaminated with lead as well. So there was a settlement. I would have to double check, but I believe it was on the order of $3 million.
Oh my God.
And Kramer is required to do the soil remediation for these houses that are adjacent to the smelter. So I think that was the case that really galvanized the community. And then next came the campaign to shut down.
Could I ask around what time that was? Sorry to interrupt.
This was in the early 2000s, and Berro formed in 2004. Formally, although, they were meeting and getting organized up until that point in time. And then after Kramer, the major campaign focus revolved around getting the these last urban coal-fired power plants of Fisk and Crawford to get shut down. And so Crawford is in Little Village and Fisk is in Pilsen. But that then became the focus. But there are other sites as well, like there was another lead-contaminated site called the Lowenthal Metals site. It was the site of a former factory. I believe it was maybe also a smelter. The site of El Paseo Community Gardens is the site of a former railroad, and that whole corridor was also lead contaminated.
That happened around early 2000s. So you said Barrow kind of formed around mid 2000s. So what sort of campaigns or work is Barrow directly in and has done? How have you guys challenged that environmental racism?
Sure. Pilsen, well, let me just go through the dates roughly. Barrow formed in 2004, and it was initially around Kramer. The coal-fired power plants, I believe, were shut down eventually after a long community coalition campaign in I believe it was 2012. Current campaigns are around a lot of enforcing permitting or permitting enforcement. So because Pilsen is within this I-55 industrial corridor, heavy industrial processes are permitted to release a certain amount of emissions that are on this TRI, which is the toxic release inventory. So a company can apply for a permit to release, say, 20 tons of, some contaminant into the air as part of their, allowable amount of emissions. There aren't that many mechanisms to prevent these permits from being granted, like on a legal basis. Mm-hmm. There's legislation, or hopefully there are efforts to create legislation that would rectify that situation. So currently, Barrow is monitoring several situations that are ongoing. They're also monitoring a situation with Sims, which is a global company that is a metal shredder, and they, similar to General Iron, they recycle metals by shredding them, shredding old cars, and that can release a lot of particulate matter 2.5 or in VOCs, VOMs, those kinds of things. And they were fined a few years ago for not being compliant with testing, or it was emissions, and it was $250,000 fine. And I think they had to improve their housing over the shredder so that fewer particles were let loose. The other thing that Barrow worked on was educating residents about the danger from the city changing out the lead water main pipes in the city of Chicago. The city was not required to alert residents about the dangers of lead that was released into the water mains when they changed the lead pipes out. So Barrow conducted public meetings and handed out free water filters. And eventually, the city instituted a policy where residents can get a free water filter. But this is the kind of information that, unless you exert public pressure, there's no incentive to do something because you're not legally required to do so, even if it's in the best interest of public health.
Right. So are a lot of your campaigns direct negotiations with these companies, or is it more coming at it from like a law side or like a legislative policy side? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And just to be clear, I am not a scientist, and I am not a chemist, and I am not... You
don't have to be, don't worry.
A lot of the communication goes through the Illinois EPA or the US EPA, because they are the ones who are responsible for issuing the permits and for enforcing them.
Mm-hmm.
Representatives at the EPA, these processes take a long time. And then once you get, say, you file a FOIA and you get some test result back, and then you have to like interpret those results and make meaning from them. And that's the kind of thing that I'm, very ill-equipped to do. But fortunately, there are other volunteers within Perro who have expertise in chemistry or else have just been doing this a lot longer than I have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So how has state and federal government, if at all, responded to your guys' campaigns against environmental racism in Pilsen?
Certainly under the previous administration, the federal government has been, or the EPA was so defunded mm-hmm. that a lot of folks who worked within the EPA and, because they held values that are aligned with protecting public health and protecting environmental resources and making them work for everyone, were pretty hamstrung by the limitations placed on them by the administration. In general, I think, the Illinois EPA, they're limited by budget constraints and everything, and they're trying to be responsive, and they, will be in communication, but they're also limited by legislation. And I'm not an attorney, but for example, like in the case of General Iron, they're claiming that there was no basis to deny them a permit based on their application. So there are failures that are systemic, that don't protect communities who are already having to bear a disproportionate burden of toxics and hazardous waste. And so you look at where hazardous waste is concentrated and emissions are concentrated, and it's in these zones on the southeast side and in the industrial 55 corridor. And the residents in these places are primarily Black and brown, and they're minoritized. And the history of environmental justice shows us that it's easier for these companies to go to places where there's less resistance. There's, traditionally less resistance because there's less power. And Chicago, the legacies of redlining and the industrial development and the steel mills on the south side have a lot to do with where these disproportionate burdens continue to exist.
So who or what has been the biggest challenge in your work?
It's the lag time, and it's the lack of responsiveness or just how slow the process is. And there's this balance too, there are accusations of you just want to kill all the jobs and you want to, there's this tension, a traditional tension, right, between jobs versus environment. I think the way that Perro has been operating is based on how there is no legal mechanism that forces the permitting process to take into account cumulative burden. Mm-hmm. So the way the campaigns have been running are on the basis of enforcement. And so, there's a hardcore group of, 5 or 6 people who regularly come to these meetings every other week. Mm-hmm. And before the pandemic, they meet in a little taco restaurant, and that's where people conduct their business. But this is a very small, committed group of people. So I would say the challenges are the existing legal structures that don't take these considerations into account, and the lag in communication and turnaround. Some of these issues, it's been going on for 2 years trying to get an answer about what is the testing status with SIMS.
So would you say that maybe making changes at a policy, state or federal level would significantly sort of help you guys out with speeding up that work?
Definitely. I have in mind particularly a law that was passed in New Jersey last summer at the end of August, that required cumulative burden or cumulative impact to be taken into account, such that no one community could be substantially overburdened with hazardous waste or toxic emissions. Like, that precedent is an exciting breakthrough, and with any luck and with persistence, Illinois could get a similar kind of law passed. I think that kind of a policy level change is critical to the success of future environmental justice endeavors in Illinois. We're trying.
Yeah, I'm sure that must be a struggle. So how do you see science and scientists helping in this fight against environmental racism?
There is such a need for scientific expertise and citizen science as well. For example, Cheryl Johnson at People for Community Recovery, she's a bit of a legend in the environmental justice community, as is her mother, Hazel Johnson. But in these places that are burdened with disproportionate levels of toxicity, bringing in those with scientific expertise to, say, train the teenagers at Alcald Gardens, or to conduct workshops to train citizens on how to test their own soil and how to test their own water, that would be really, really valuable. Also, what to do to properly deal with contaminated sites, whether it's contamination from, asbestos, lead, PCBs, experts in bioremediation or phytoremediating plants that could educate folks on how to make their soils more healthy. Because in a lot of these sites where there's lead pollution or other heavy metals, people would like to, say, garden to be more self-reliant or have their own food resources. But if the soil is contaminated, you either have to create raised beds or you have to deal with remediating the soil. So I know that some of these processes are long-term, but I think there's a huge need and a huge role that scientists can play in educating and empowering residents to exert more agency and control over the quality of the environment in their community, and also how to, what to look for to be suspicious or to report suspicious emissions or odors. One of the dreams that Cheryl told me about was a dream that her mother had, which was to, and Cheryl can obviously expand on this and tell you a lot more, but to create the Hazel Johnson Environmental Institute in Altgeld Gardens, which would be perfectly sited to train anyone who's interested in polluted sites, how to remediate them and how to work within them, and how to train the next generation to also learn the skills of healthy water management, or how to have industry that is that has all the best safety controls and the best filtration systems.
Those are really good ideas. But a lot of the solutions are, about the individual, but a lot of these problems do result from like systemic levels. So what else do you think can be done at a sort of broader scale to help lessen, the weight, the burden that's often put on so many individuals to like fix the problem? Because, as much as we can, at some point, like you said, if governments are just not being responsive, something needs to be done.
I am so excited about your generation, upcoming generations who are going to change all these policies and laws to make them actually serve residents and people. So I look forward to seeing young scientists like yourself testifying at community meetings or in front of at City Hall and to zoning planning boards, and making evidence-based decisions about what is really in the best long-term interest for future generations and for the biodiversity that we all depend on for life.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So I guess my last question for you is just, what can listeners do to help this cause, Barrow's cause, Barrow specifically? What should we be called to do? How can we help?
Well, you can check out some of the work that we do. Our website is going to be updated very soon, but the current website is pilsenperro.org, pilsenperro.org. You can find out about our meeting schedule there. You can donate money, which helps us to purchase things like air monitors and set up more testing. Yeah, it increases our capacity to do the work that we do. Yeah, and get yourself informed. Take a toxic tour with any number of organizations that conduct them, although now during the time of COVID, that's happening less. But and mostly get outside and enjoy the parks and the nature and take care of it, and ask questions, and don't assume that your interests are always being looked after. That isn't always the case. You can there's a lot of good work that are being done by these grassroots organizations. I'm also thinking about the Neighbors for Environmental Justice, Blacks in Green, the Garfield Park Community Organization, forgetting on them, Southwest Environmental Alliance. They're all folks who are grassroots and doing lots of good work. Definitely support the fight that the Southeast Environmental Task Force is doing right now to prevent General Iron from, transferring from a north side location to an already heavily burdened community on the southeast side. Follow that story. The feds are now investigating. There was I just wanted to mention that there was a map that the NRDC published, was it 2018 or 2019, on cumulative burden that shows how environmental racism looks like when it's mapped out. You look at where heavy industry is concentrated, and it's along these demographics and along these socioeconomic figures. And this, I don't think, is surprising to anybody, but it's always nice to have maps that confirm it. Yeah, I mean, there's other evidence as well, such as, the disparity in life expectancy. Chicago has the largest life expectancy gap of a major city in the U.S., and it's a 30-year difference from Streeterville to Englewood, and 6 miles away. It's a 30-year life expectancy difference.
From speaking with Dr. Zimring and Joshi, I hope our listeners feel called to look into their own communities and see where environmental racism is present. As scientists, we have an incredible role in fighting environmental racism, as Joshi explained, and as community members, we must wield our power at a legislative and structural level. Dr. Zimring more than made clear how structural this issue is, and it is through policy that perhaps we can make a difference in the lives of Black and brown individuals who are being poisoned by their own government. We'd like to thank you for listening and encourage you to check out more episodes from The Human Variable, a podcast by University of Chicago Science Policy Group. Funding for The Human Variable was provided by Research America, who are dedicated to elevating the importance of scientific research, innovation, and public health in the national conversation. The host of this episode was Manaeha Rao. That's it from The Human Variable. Until next time, be a part of the solution.